Cool. So if you haven't, check it out. It's a fun show, really interesting history behind it. This man has had an interesting and unique opportunity to work alongside Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the real Dr. J. Allen Hynek, not the one you see in the show. And this is a great opportunity again for him to come out and share about his experience. He was one of his special investigators and a former director of the Hynek Center for UFO Studies. And not just that, but he was a director of special investigations for 10 years and got to work with Hynek for the last 10 years of his life. And so this man has some pretty incredible encounters that he's gone through with different people and these cases that he studies, renowned when it comes to the Roswell incident. And so we're very fortunate to have him. As seen on History Channel's Project Blue Book, this is, again, a person who got to work alongside the real Dr. J. Allen Hynek. So let's please welcome Don Schmitt.
This microphone's removed. Very good. Thank you so much. No. You did a great job. I'll pass that on. So the check's in the mail soon.
Look forward to it.
I like to move around, so I'm a moving target that way. I think so many of you involved with this topic, you realize that my foremost involvement is with the Roswell incident. We've done now 15 books on that one case and over 30 documentaries. We've had 5 archaeological digs at the crash site. Our first book was made into the Roswell movie starring Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, Dwight Yoakam. And I always say, most importantly, we've interviewed over 600 people directly or indirectly involved with the 1947 incident. And just as Dr. J. Allen Hynek was a complete skeptic when he was enlisted, when he was enrolled into the very subject matter of UFOs, I was a skeptic as Dr. Hynek. The first case we wanted to investigate was Roswell. And what most people don't realize is Hynek, before he died, was very interested in Roswell. In fact, colleagues of mine would suggest that, well, Dr. J. Allen Hynek had no interest in crash retrieval cases. That's a book unto itself. In fact, the next book of ours that is coming out in June is a total revision of the Wright-Patterson book. And we have 3 new chapters, and mostly deal with Hynek and his quest for securing information on crash retrieval cases. Again, the real J. Allen Hynek. Not what you see portrayed on television as far as in this series, and we're going to be going through that. We love the fact that he's getting the homage, getting as far as the credit that he so richly deserves, but he's been gone now since 1986. And how many, I'm sure most of you have seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Where do you think that title comes from? J. Allen Hynek. His classification of UFOs, first kind, second kind, third kind. Third kind being UFO with occupants. And then his classic cameo at the end where he steps out on Devil's Tower, with his goatee and with his pipe. 7 seconds. He would always talk about his 7 seconds that he was in a Steven Spielberg movie. Now, most of you also seen the movie Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, correct? What's the final scene in that movie? When the Ark of the Covenant is being lowered into the crate and nailed shut and wheeled into this huge hangar, this secret hangar of all these, secret, as far as acquirements that the military and the government has secured through the years. And so I would see that movie, and I would say to Dr. Hynek, Allen, I would say, next time you talk with Spielberg, you ask him what he's implying, what he's inferring in that final scene. So they had already been talking about doing a sequel to the Close Encounters movie. So some months would pass, and I get a phone call one morning, and he goes, Don, it's Alan. I just had breakfast with Steven. We're talking about the movie, and I asked your question. And you were correct. Spielberg was suggesting that if they had a crash saucer and if they couldn't figure out how it ran, that's all they would do with it. They'd crate it up and bury it for all time. In other words, if you can't find the on button, what else can you do? So I love the fact that we were always thinking that way. I love the fact that with Hynek, you could sit down and it was like, no boundaries, no barriers, your wildest theories, everybody, come on, put them on the table. His last interview with Omni magazine, he was asked, if you had one last thing you could do in your life, what would it be? And he said, it would be to be snowbound in Upper Michigan with a captive audience for a weekend. Because I would tell them what I really think, what I really feel, what I really believe is going on. And that again coming from a total skeptic. Someone who, as the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State, just happened to be at the right place at the right time in 1949. And he was enlisted. Just down the road, he's in Columbus, Ohio State, and just down the road at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they were just coming off of Project Sign, the very first investigation of UFOs. And most of you who are students of the subject, what was Project Sign's first conclusion of the phenomenon? That it was extraterrestrial. The Air Force's first conclusion about the UFO phenomenon was that it was real. That we were dealing with a phenomenon off the planet. Well, we never saw that, did we? Because it was ordered destroyed. General Hoyt Vandenberg said that it lacked physical evidence and he ordered that it be destroyed. And then the next project, very fittingly, was called what? Project Grudge. That's where Hynek came in. They cleared out most of the pro-ET investigators, researchers, scientists, military officers. And they brought Hynek in again, as I described, as a complete skeptic, with the thought that if we failed in explaining away a particular sighting report, Hynek, as the scientific consultant, would always come in with an astronomical, a meteorological, a scientific explanation. Because the Air Force already was gearing up for the situation that they were going to explain away every case they could. And we're going to demonstrate that contrary to what the TV series is portraying, that Hynek was the one who was always, well, but what about this? What about that? We can't explain this, can we? With Hynek, it was the exact opposite. He was the one that was always coming up with every explanation, short of extraterrestrial, that they could. And we're going to see the gradual change and what particular cases did change him. To the point that just imagine a scientist, a doctor, anyone of that level of experience and profession, having to admit they were 180% wrong on a subject, especially of this nature, of this level. And it would take quite a man to do that, quite a woman to do that. To say, I was wrong for 20 years of my life about something. And this is what I feel, this is what I believe, and this is what I stand on at this point in my life. Because we all know, we all have friends, we all have associates that, nope, doesn't matter what the facts are. You know, my mind's made up. It's what the skeptics are. That's what the scoffers, the debunkers are. But skepticism in its true form is a case of, I'm skeptical until I see reason to move on to another level. Either more doubt or a greater acceptance. And Hynek was certainly the latter. Because as he would say, all these people just can't be lying. I can't just continue listening to witness after witness, up to 4-star generals telling me what they experienced. And then say, well, the Air Force doesn't want me to lean as far as in your direction. Because Hynek, obviously, he had his own top security clearance. He went, he followed, he was a good soldier in that regard. He wasn't military, but nonetheless, he had a top security clearance and he followed orders. But also, he was foremost a scientist. And he debated and he argued. He constantly appealed for further investigation. Because no matter what the explanation for the phenomenon, Hynek felt that as a scientist, he was committed, he was devoted to come up with a solution. No matter what direction it took him. Because foremost, he was a scientist. And he just couldn't get the military brass to think scientifically. Because they behaved as though, well, we got to go by the Air Force manual. And it says UFOs don't exist, so that's what we have to stick to. And Hynek realized that, again, all these people can't be hallucinating. They can't all be lying. You see his signature at the bottom? I'm just going to toss this out. That's my signature. I was so good at doing Hynek's signature that I'd be sitting in the office and he would toss a pile of papers in front of me and say, Don, sign them. And so instead of stamping, someone's name, I was actually Jalen Hynek. So certainly before, as far as the computers and as far as social media where, you actually were signing hard copy. So this is, and you saw this earlier as far as I think with the Socorro, with Ben and Tony. And most people are of the impression, because the TV show creates the impression, that Blue Book was this major, study of the UFO phenomena. That they had carte blanche, limited budget, and that they were able to travel as far as anywhere around the country. They were able to recreate UFO cases, rent aircraft, and actually go up in the sky and recreate, like Godman Air Force Base incident, which they never actually investigated. In fact, the Blue Book series, half the cases they've already portrayed, Blue Book never investigated. So you may not know that, but I can state that as a fact. Like the Kelly Hopkinsville case from Kentucky, for example, never investigated. Godman, they never investigated. I don't know why, considering that Blue Book has a wealth of strong cases that could be dramatized, could be portrayed. And yet they decided to create the impression that the Air Force was on top of all of these reports. They weren't. Because this was the Blue Book staff. That was the extent of it. 2 investigators, this was the last director who was Major Hector Quintanilla, sitting secretary who would type up the reports, and 2 investigators. They'd get into a single engine plane and go flying off, and then Quintanilla would always say, and make sure you come back with an explanation. In fact, Hynek would refer to Quintanilla as a nasty officer. He and Hynek were feuding constantly. They despised one another because Hynek wanted the facts. He wanted all the details of the cases. In fact, Hynek would constantly point out to Quintanilla that the more information they had, the better the cases, the more likely they were genuine UFOs. Whereas Quintanilla wanted to keep the information from Hynek. Hynek would, in his monthly jaunts from Chicago, because from Ohio State, he would move to Evanston, Illinois, and he'd be the head of the astronomy department at Northwestern in Evanston. So he lived in Evanston, Ridge Avenue, just down from Evanston Memorial Hospital. So every month, his secretary from the university, Jenny Zeidman, would drive him down to Wright Pat in Dayton. 6 hours, well, actually 5 hours from Chicago. And he would wade through all these monthly reports. And Alan would constantly, I spoke to this SAC officer, the Strategic Air Command officer, or I talked to this pilot. Where's that case? Where's this case? And we don't know what you're talking about. Because they were censoring. They were making sure that Hynek never saw the good cases. In fact, very early on, Hynek would start to lament all the hardcore cases were not going to Blue Book, they were going upstairs. Well, obviously, where's upstairs? Well, it was the Pentagon. In fact, we'll be getting to him shortly, but General Arthur Exon, who was a base commander at Wright Pat, would describe the actual investigation. Not Blue Book, but the real team that would arrive in from Washington, because they were investigating the true hardcore cases. This was Blue Book. That was the extent of it. Not what the TV show portrays, but what you see here. How much, if I had to rely on 2 people and a secretary, I don't think we would have gotten much done on Roswell as far as within 10 years. And they were investigating cases all over the country. So is it any wonder? And yet they would claim, at the close of Blue Book, they investigated over 13,000 cases. And 701 remain unexplained. And the 701 that remained unexplained were just that they never investigated. All they could do was classify them as unknown, unexplained. Because again, they did not have the people power, the manpower, the woman power. Dr. Donald Menzel, the eminent Harvard professor, who was always kind of nipping at Hynek's ankles. And Alan would describe to us that they would be looking at gun camera footage, or they'd be looking at like the Tremonton, Utah, or the Great Falls, Montana, daylight disc sighting of the UFOs in formation. And that Menzel would always step into the office, at Wright Pat, and he'd walk in and he'd just look at the screen and he'd go, birds, just birds. And he'd turn and walk out. So again, always take the easy explanation out. No investigation, first impression, and guess which explanation then the Earth was put down? Dr. Menzel's. Hey, nothing but birds. Lubbock, Texas, nothing but plover with, as far as birds, with the skylights, the street lamps reflecting off of their bellies, that type of thing. It's not UFOs flying in formation. So it set a pattern. It created, it established a means by which the Air Force could explain away everything and anything they were investigating. Now you see that in the TV series, where it's the Air Force that is, again, always trying to come up with the conventional explanation. And it's Hynek that is always acting like, well, again, he's playing the devil's advocate. Now, he did it within his own circle of scientific colleagues, but again, I'm going to demonstrate how he still was a total skeptic. He was going along because he would say, well, Alan, if you didn't agree with the Air Force's actual methodology, why did you stay on? And he would say, because I wanted access to the data. I still wanted to be there in the event something ever happened. If one landed on the White House front lawn, they'd go, Dr. Hynek, you need to get there right away. I want to be there for the end of the race, so to speak. Major Donald Keyhoe, Marine Corps. Many of you have read some of his books. In fact, he was, as far as not only the military, but he would become the most profound writer in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, 1950s, his first book on the subject. And he was immediately convinced that the phenomenon was real. His books were all pro-UFO. It was wonderful in that he was the first one, and especially as a military officer, established a genuine phenomenon. In fact, Keyhoe could easily be portrayed in the Blue Book series because he was that much a thorn in the side of the Air Force. That much always calling and crying foul at Blue Book for what they were doing throughout the course of their investigation. So much so that the Pentagon would start feeding him cases. Now you would ask, well, why were they doing that? Well, they were giving him mundane cases, hoping he would go fly off in one direction, investigate some lights in the sky, when an actual landing, or a landing with occupants, or an encounter with pilots, or a commercial flight would be happening in the other end of the country. So they kept him occupied. And as a result, he still came away totally convinced there was a genuine UFO phenomenon. Back then, they didn't call them extraterrestrial. They called them interplanetary. Because we didn't know. In fact, there was still strong reason to believe that maybe Mars, maybe Venus, even Saturn was inhabited. We just didn't have that information, that knowledge that we presently have. And so the word was typically interplanetary, but nonetheless, it was still off the planet. Another Donald, but last name, Dr. James McDonald, University of Arizona in Phoenix, who was another advocate of the pro-UFO situation. And he would argue with Hynek. He would come to Northwestern, and there was one time where he was pounding his fist on Hynek's desk. Why aren't you sharing all the data with your fellow scientists? So again, Hynek would explain, I have a top secret clearance. You have to respect that, you have to understand that. And believe me, he would assure McDonald that if something happens, then I can turn around and hopefully enlist the rest of you into the project. The phenomenon was such, and I think we all see that. We don't know what's going to happen tonight. We don't know that something extremely, momentous happens even tomorrow regarding the subject. Something that the government can't contain, something that the press is able to actually legitimately report. Imagine if there would be a crash, in New Mexico today. And instead of the witnesses going to the military, they go to the press. Well, some would say by today's standards that even the press wouldn't get it right, but at least we might get some inkling of the truth. There's a much greater chance that it would get out today than it certainly did 50, 70 years ago. And that's what Hynek was always keen on. The thought that this is all leading up to a revelation. A landing on the White House front lawn, as we all, even the movies have long envisioned. And yet, Hynek realized that they were only digging in deeper and deeper. They were only nailing the lids of the coffins, so to speak, and the crates tighter and tighter and tighter. Because the media was starting to join in on the chorus of, you're not telling us the truth. I mean, the Pentagon was having press conferences and the press was reporting, but that's what they say. Because the witnesses totally disagree. And as Hynek himself was starting to get in trouble with the Air Force, because he was going around Blue Book and he was talking to witnesses constantly on his own. He couldn't get on a plane without the pilots calling him up to the cabin, the cockpit, and telling this lead scientist investigating the phenomenon about some of their own experiences. He would go on the lecture circuit, and he constantly had people approach and supply him with data, with information. And is it any wonder, again, he started to make the turn. He started to realize that, my God, these people are all they're all witnessing the same phenomenon. And it doesn't sound like, and heaven help us if it's not ours. Early on in the investigation, interesting, how many know of Battelle Labs, as far as Institute in Columbus, Ohio? Very famous laboratory, government contracted, just down the road from, again, Wright-Patterson. It's located in Columbus, Ohio. Would you have ever believed, again, a government contracted laboratory putting on such a talk, UFO crash at Roswell? That was in January of 1994. It was the first time any speaker ever filled up Battelle Auditorium, over 800 people, the night of an ice storm. And all the front rows were Battelle scientists taking notes through my entire lecture on Roswell. But Battelle was also directly involved very early on with Blue Book and with Dr. Hynek. There was a project that they would say never existed. It was called Project Stork. And Hynek, again, is a scientist, and he was working with the then newly appointed director of Project Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt. And the process with Battelle was that they were going to start to do statistical analysis of the UFO reports. Start looking for patterns. Start looking as far as patterns within witnesses, the conditions, weather, locations, times, within military regions, military as far as airspace, everything and anything, to see if there was some intelligence dealing with the phenomenon. So here was the director of Blue Book at the time, and Ruppelt was totally objective. He himself saw that there was indeed a UFO phenomenon. And he and Hynek could not have been a better twosome, a better team. But he had total resistance once again from the Air Force. Because inasmuch as Project Stork and Battelle Institute made every effort to conduct a legitimate study, the Air Force stonewalled it, sabotaged it. In fact, when the report finally came out, Special Report number 14, the Air Force would claim that all but 2% of the cases investigated by Stork were legitimate, when in reality, 20% were unexplained, which is a very high percentage. When you consider of 3,000 some cases, 20% Project Stork could not explain. In other words, legitimately classified as UFOs. This is Captain Ruppelt. Ruppelt would then, in his frustration, resign from the project, retire from the project, a year and a half after he started with it, because he realized that, as Hynek would complain, everything was going in the Blue Book and nothing was coming out. All the good cases were bypassing Blue Book and he didn't have access. Again, students of ufology, what happened in July of 1952 that totally turned the Air Force on their ear? The DC overflights, week apart as far as the national, as far as where they buzzed the White House, formations of UFOs buzzing the White House. And Ruppelt immediately demanded that I want to talk to all the pilots involved. We're supposed to be investigating the UFO situation. I demand that we're able to talk to the pilots, the men in the towers who were tracking the unknowns, everybody and anybody who was involved. And the Pentagon went, you're not to talk to a single one. Well, am I in charge of this project or not? And he realized he wasn't. So that again was another example of where Ruppelt realized the project was totally contrived. It was a PR front. The TV series is once again trying to demonstrate it as a legitimate investigation of the UFO phenomenon. They didn't investigate UFOs. They provided the smokescreen, the public impression, the media impression for what was really going on behind the scenes. And as far as the public was concerned, there was no UFO phenomenon. There were no legitimate UFOs. Because the Air Force is obviously, their foremost goal is the defense of the country. And if they say they have total control of the skies, there's nothing invading our airspace, there is no UFO phenomenon, sounds good enough to me. I can get on with my regular job and raise my family and go to church on Sunday, nothing to worry about. And yet Ruppelt was the one who actually made the statement in his book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, and I'm going to paraphrase. But by the end of July of 1947, The Pentagon, ATIC, Air Technical Intelligence Committee, was in a total panic over the situation. Now, what had happened in July of 1947? Roswell. Well, Roswell was explained away, again, by the Army Air Corps / Air Force as a weather balloon device. And here's Ruppelt, who would have known, who said the Pentagon was in a panic. Can you imagine we would hear that today? That the Pentagon was in a panic over anything? And they're in a panic over something that they're also claiming doesn't exist. Roswell was just a balloon. UFOs, which they weren't designated at that time. In fact, Ruppelt was the first one who actually used that terminology. Unidentified flying objects, UFOs. He coined that very term. But for him to have said that, and not at the time, but years later, so is it any wonder that the Air Force was doing all they could to slow down the release of information, to make every effort to get a handle on what they were dealing with? And especially if they're dealing with a technology that we're down here and they're up there, how do you bridge that technology? How do you find that on button, so to speak, as I said earlier? So all they could do was stall, run the clock out, buy time, hoping again that something would happen that would provide them with answers. I'll say it now, and I'm going to say it at the end of my talk. It remains a cover-up of ignorance. After all these years, they still do not know from where, from why, from who. So what do they disclose? I mean, anytime someone tells you they know exactly where they're from, maybe you do, but the Air Force, the government doesn't. Again, that's not their purview. Their purview, their objective in all this is to maintain control. Governments exist to maintain control. Politicians are in perpetual campaign mode. Stay in office, stay in control. Anything that jeopardizes that, threatens that, is cast aside with the hope that you won't see that. Watch this hand as you toss something away with the other hand. And it continues, and believe me, I think we are witnessing the fact it's worse than ever. Because we're to the point right now, we don't know what to believe anymore. And the point is, this all started at the time that the phenomenon arrived. And keeping in mind, too, when was the War of the Worlds broadcast? 1938, very good. So this was very fresh in their minds at that time. You know, we look back and we go, well, I wouldn't have reacted like that. Well, I would have said, tell the world. I saw this, or I know what I saw, or what I believe. But you have to think back post-World War II, and especially back then, where the military walked on water. They were invincible. They had saved the world, Nazism from Imperial Japan. And so whatever the government, whatever the military said back then was accepted without qualification. But what's also interesting is that within a week after Roswell, what did President Harry Truman sign? The National Security Act, which for the first time gave all branches of the military and all departments of intelligence authority to spy on every American in this country. And again, the fact that it happened right after Roswell. As though now we have to make sure that if anybody actually does secure proof, physical evidence on this phenomenon, we're right there to take it away. We're right there to prevent it from leaking out. I mean, who would have ever thought? And last year alone, I lectured in Russia, in China, and so I could bring this up. Who would have ever thought in this country? And I always cite whistleblower, former NSA Edward Snowden. Whether you think he be traitor or hero. Who would have ever thought that an American would have to flee to Russia for asylum in this country? Who would have predicted that 10 years ago in this country? Absolutely not. We're there. We're there. Crazy times. But again, I can't emphasize enough where it all originated. Because for having worked with these people, having served in the field and been out, and Dr. Hynek in his latter years, I'm an old man in a hurry. I'm an old man still trying to solve this. Because when you can't even rely on your own government, the people that we elect, to at least share with us something of this monumental, we're talking the biggest story of the millennium, and a handful of people have decided for all time. Who elected them? Because we're not talking politicians. In fact, last time Bill Clinton, President Clinton, was on Jimmy Kimmel. Did anybody happen to see this? Last time he was on Jimmy Kimmel, this is all he talked about. And as he was first, introduced, and he's laughing, and he's, he's throwing his head back and his arms, and the moment Kimmel brings up Roswell, and Clinton his fingers start digging into the armrest, and he starts clenching his jaw. I had 8 years in the Oval Office, and I couldn't get the truth about Roswell. And Jimmy Carter had promised he was going to release all the UFO files once he became president. If they didn't threaten national security. Well, I guess they all threaten national security, don't they? Or again, was he too told, don't even ask, Mr. President. And then we can have the skeptics, standing next to me. Yeah, but Don, the phenomena doesn't exist. You can explain it all away. It's all weather balloons. It's all birds. It's all planets. It's all our aircraft. Then what in God's name are you covering up? Because I could have former Presidents Clinton and Carter, late Senator Barry Goldwater, the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, former Governor of New Mexico Bill Richardson, all standing up on this stage with me, and they would all lament the fact we could not get the truth about UFOs. So what is that truth? I'd like to think that in this TV series, they're at least demonstrating a shadow, some glimpses, because they're dealing with legitimate cases, albeit not necessarily investigated by Blue Book, but nonetheless, they're creating an audience. They're creating a level of respectability that there was a legitimate investigation or an attempt thereof. And the one person who was attempting to do it, was J. Allen Hynek. And he thought he finally had an ally with Captain Edward Ruppelt, and Ruppelt threw up his hands. I'm out of here, I'm done. So a year and a half later, as I described, he's resigning from the project. I'm going to skip this. There was the Pentagon memo as far as what Hynek, and there was another example of where after the Robertson panel, the CIA investigation of UFOs after the Washington overflights in July of 1952, the CIA stepped in and decided that the witnesses were more dangerous than the phenomenon. That the UFO reports could tie up communications, and that the Soviet Union at that time could launch a fake attack, distracting us believing it was UFOs, and then have a sneak attack elsewhere. That was their reasoning back in 1953. Hynek was invited to that panel. They sat there for 14 hours, all of 2 days, investigating the entire phenomenon. In the Robertson panel, there they have the very consultant, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and according to Hynek, they did not ask him one question. Because again, they weren't interested. Had nothing to do with the actual investigation of the phenomenon. It's like, how do we get the Air Force out of this quagmire? How do we get them out of this situation? So, Ruppelt was gone. The CIA was now calling the shots in many regards. So then the next director of Blue Book, Captain George Gregory, he was dead set on explaining away all the reports. In fact, it was his goal within the first year to bring all the explains down to almost zero. And he actually came close. By the end of 54, he was down to 2%, and by the end of 55, he was down to 1.4. From 20% down to practically zero. So everything that was possible or probable all of a sudden became explained. Most of you saw the Socorro presentation by Ben and Tony this morning. And you saw that Hynek was prominently described as far as part of the investigation. In the TV series, they constantly show Hynek in the field, recreating, reliving the situation, talking to the witnesses. Sadly, he didn't, in reality. As I described, he would go down the right pad every month, read through the reports. Some of them he would follow up on by talking to witnesses over the phone, but as far as actually in-field investigation, no. Socorro was one exception. Socorro And the Air Force would later admit that they made a major mistake by letting Hynek involved because he was watching. He was making sure they got it right. As I mentioned when I showed the first picture of the whole Blue Book team with Major Hector Quintanilla, that Quintanilla made every effort to explain Socorro away. In fact, I want to read a quote from Hynek where he said, "I wish I could go for my own peace of mind, dismiss the Socorro sighting as a hoax or a hallucination, but in all honesty, I cannot." Because again, he was an honest scientist. He knew that it was a rock-solid case. And then the Air Force was forced to acknowledge that it was a vehicle, as you heard earlier. And it remains unexplained to this day. And it was the case that finally turned Hynek in the right direction. And when I say the right direction, it's because as long as you remain steadfast in saying anything but extraterrestrial, again, anything but the facts, anything but the truth, you're always going in the wrong direction. So here's where Hynek started to realize more and more that we are dealing with an actual phenomenon. We are dealing with something that clearly is demonstrating it is far superior than anything that we've ever encountered before. He was always the Pentagon spokesperson, the Project Blue Book spokesperson. He was always the press conference as far as with answering all the questions of the press. And when there was a legitimate hoax, like in this particular case, again, that was his job. But then, so would any legitimate UFO investigator. If it's clearly explainable, you explain. Most of you recognize the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld, originally, when he served in the Congress in Illinois, who happened to be one of his constituents? J.L. Hynek. In fact, when they had the congressional hearings in Washington in 1966, who introduced J.L. Hynek in glowing terms, but none other than Congressman Donald Rumsfeld. And then when Gerald Ford would assume the presidency after Watergate, when Nixon resigned, and he appointed Rumsfeld as his Secretary of Defense, Hynek was in Washington, and he paid him a visit. As we remember, Rumsfeld then went on to be also George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. But this was during the Ford administration. And so Hynek would meet with Rumsfeld at his office in Washington. And Hynek would remind him, "Mr. Secretary, I've given you 19 years of my life investigating the UFO phenomenon. 19 years I consulted with Project Blue Book. And I was given no answers, no final report. I believe I deserve an explanation." And Alan would describe how Rumsfeld got up from behind his desk, walked over where Hynek was sitting, leaned down, pointed his finger in his face and said, "You have no right to know." Obviously there's something to know, but we don't have any right to know. And here was the very man who was their number one scientist, bailing them out week after week, day after day, providing them with explanations to give them this breathing room so they could further investigate what was really going on behind the scenes. And then that's how he's repaid. That's how he finally, received his final, avocation as far as all that he had provided, all the hours, the years that he had provided investigating the UFO phenomenon for this United States of America. And he's told, "Doesn't matter to me. We're not going to tell you anything." Does anybody believe that maybe that's the same situation that even the president faces today? When they're told, when they say, "I had 8 years in the Oval Office and I couldn't get the truth"? I always love it, as far as when I debate, and they're not skeptics, they're debunkers, they're scoffers. And I'll talk about all these high-ranking officials, and I'll talk about even up to 4-star generals who have admitted it's real, but I'm under orders, I'm under a security oath, I can't say anything, but it is real. How these skeptics, these scoffers, these seem to know more than even the president. They have the answers. They can stand up here and tell us all what's really going on. And I always say, I would love to have your sources. Who are your sources that they're even above the president? Their sources are them. And for any of you sitting here this afternoon, if you haven't realized that by now, And yet, when we were doing Larry King, and the first time regarding Roswell, and we were ready, and King had some notes prepared from us, and many remember the late Philip J. Klass. And King would ask Klass, now, have you ever been to New Mexico? Well, no, Larry, I haven't. Well, have you ever talked to any of the witnesses? Well, no, Larry, I haven't. Well, then what are you doing here? Because that's it. How do you claim to be an authority on anything when you haven't even talked to the very witnesses involved? You haven't even gone back to the crime scene, so to speak. And so I appreciate the fact that the TV series is portraying this as a hands-on. They're actually at the scene of the crime, so to speak. But I'm sorry to report, as I've been describing, that in reality, they didn't. They didn't recreate, they didn't talk to the witnesses even for that matter. Quintanilla, there was a famous Ohio police case in 1966, which involved going from Ohio into Pennsylvania, high-speed chase. In fact, in the Closer Encounters movie, where the police cars are chasing what looks like a speeding car, and it even goes through the toll booths, and then all at once the UFO shoots up into the sky and the police car shoots off the road as if it's still following it, and down the ravine, the embankment. That's from that Ohio that police case, because that's what happened. The UFO all at once went straight and the car tried to follow and there was no road anymore. But Quintanilla would call up one of the police officers involved and he would say, "Tell me about the hallucination you just had." So you think you're going to turn right around and try to convince them otherwise? As if it's going to matter? So again, those were the people that Hynek had to work with. This is the late Dr. Edward Ucondon of the infamous Colorado UFO study from 1966 to 1968. So it provided the Project Blue Book, the Air Force, with an out, their scapegoat, because it provided them with an outside investigation of the phenomenon that was supposed to have been objective, unbiased, and yet in their final report, 1,400 pages, 25% of the cases they investigated they couldn't explain. So their record was even worse than Project Blue Book, which was 13% that remained unexplained. Condon couldn't explain 25% of his committee. But the report came out, it went to the Academy of Science, they endorsed it, end of the official end of the government, of the military's UFO investigation. Where did Edward Condon work in 1947? We have first-hand witnesses regarding the assimilation and the testing of the Roswell wreckage at Patel Institute, Hughes Aircraft, Rand Corporation, General Electric, and the Bureau of Standards. Who was the head of the Bureau of Standards in 1947? Edward Condon. So he was already connected all the way to the beginning. And then when he takes on, as far as the study, the independent study of the phenomena, he was hardly objective, hardly unbiased. In fact, there were all types of interviews with Condon before the report was even completed where he said, you know, I realize that there's nothing to this, but I'm just earning my paycheck. In fact, they were paid over $500,000 for it. You won't be able to read these, but after Dr. J. Allen Hynek passed away in 1986, as we searched through all of his personal files, his papers that he had hidden away, these were documents, these are the originals that were hidden underneath one of the file cabinets in his office. And they date from 1970 through the fall of 1973. Working for the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, again in Dayton, Ohio. Foreign technology, originally it was T2, intelligence, after World War II, where they did all the reverse engineering of captured armory, weaponry of the Germans, of the Russians. If we managed to get our hands on a Soviet MiG, it would go to Wright-Pat, foreign technology. It's where they would again tear it down, learn from it, and rebuild it. See what makes it tick. Well, where did all the Roswell wreckage go from 1947? Went to foreign technology. In fact, one of our books deals with all the personnel, all the officers who are on the receiving end. And then all the stories of as far as the bodies and the autopsies at Wright Pat. Interesting that Blue Book would have been headquartered at Wright Pat, when all the evidence, all the truth was right below, in the vaults and the multiple levels beneath the base. But Hynek, contrary to what even most of my colleagues were led to believe, what the press, what the Air Force to this day would swear, in 1969 when Blue Book was shut down, was the end of their official involvement. Here was Hynek serving, and his job description is consultant on controversial aerial phenomenon. Now I've had colleagues who have suggested, well, that might be weather. That might be astronomical. It has nothing to do with UFOs. Controversial aerial phenomenon. And it happens to be for foreign technology. So in other words, they're keeping Hynek on a short leash. They're making sure, because one of the things that as Hynek saw that Blue Book was coming to an end, and he started to enlist the civilian UFO groups more and more. NICAP, APRO. He was getting speaking engagements more and more. So he was getting outside information. So they considered him in immediate danger. They needed to keep him under their tutelage, their control. So for the next 4 years, he would serve in that capacity with foreign technology. His boss, there's the actual appointment affidavit, United States Air Force, Foreign Technology Division, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. These are all the original documents. And you see his signature, Joseph Allen Hynek, his residence, Evanston, Illinois. And this is the original assignment, May of 1970. Blue Book shut down officially in January. So in other words, the UFO investigation continues. Headquarters Foreign Technology Division. I apologize for the quality of the picture, but this was the second last director of Project Blue Book, Colonel Robert Friend. I know Colonel Friend very well. Last time we had dinner together in Los Angeles, we talked about Hynek. We talked about Roswell. He happened to be at Wright Field in July of 1947 when the Roswell wreckage came in. If you were to ask him, was it a weather balloon, he'd be the first one to say, it was no weather balloon, we all knew what it was. Now, he still maintains to this day that it was an errant atomic bomb, a broken arrow. And when I reminded him that we didn't have any bombs in our arsenal in this country at that time, and he just smiles like, well, you shouldn't say that too loud. But he was with Hynek the last time that they had a meeting at Foreign Technology. They were meeting with their boss, Colonel George Weinbrenner. And Jenny Zeidman, Hynek's secretary, was waiting out in the car. So she witnessed it as well. When Hynek came storming out of Weinbrenner's office yelling, patsies, patsies, they're trying to make us patsies all over again. In other words, Blue Book made me a patsy. I was a patsy for Project Blue Book, and here they were trying to do it all over again 4 years later. And according to Jenny Zeidman, it was the longest drive back to Evanston because Hynek didn't say a word. He just sat there and fumed. And that evening he got on the phone, he called up Sherman Larson, who was with NICAP, and he said, you know that group you're proposing we put together, I want you to come to my office tomorrow, let's do it. And J. Allen Hynek the next day started the Center for UFO Studies. And in 1978 I became one of his investigators, and for the last 10 years of his life I served as a special investigator. I became his director of special investigations, and the last time I was with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, I will never forget his pounding his fist and what he said to me. Because here was an astronomer foremost. Hynek liked to demonstrate to his astronomy classes just what we were talking about as far as the vast distances from A to B. Hynek, above everything else, he just could not accept that anything was physically traversing from one star system, the planet Earth. When you consider that Alpha Centauri, our closest star, is 4.3 light years away. And he would use the example of a single playing card. Not the width, but the thickness of a playing card equaling the distance from the Earth to the Moon. And he would ask, how many playing cards would it take to equal the distance from the Earth to Alpha Centauri? Thickness of one card, the Earth to the Moon. Alpha Centauri, 19 miles of playing cards. And he just couldn't grasp the possibility that something could actually travel that distance. But he had to accept it. And he did accept it. Last time I had dinner with him, and as he pounded his fist, and he was saying, Don, it's smacking more and more of nuts and bolts. He would go on to say that what type of a phenomenon leaves swirled areas of grass, depressions in the ground, breaks tree branches, causes burns on the witnesses, is tracked by radar, unless it's physically there. There again, the true scientist, not by consensus, but by the facts, by the evidence that I'm observing, that I'm holding in my hand. If I can go across the street and kick the tires, the car must actually be there. I don't care how it got here, but it's there. And that's why I can look back and say, Jalen Hynek, there isn't a week that goes by that I don't miss him, that I don't think that he was the truest, the greatest scientist in the respect that if he would have had more time, then he truly might have finally put this entire phenomenon to rest. Because he was that committed. As I said, as I described, then just imagine any one of us, when he was even 70 years old, imagine any of us who are that old here, commenting constantly, I'm an old man in a hurry, I'm an old man in a hurry. That we would be at that stage in our life and still feel unfulfilled, unaccomplished, mission not finished. So that was sad. I had a difficult time watching that over and over again, but yet that was the case. That was Jenny Seidman, his private secretary. She was witness. Dr. Hynek was getting a book award for his the sales of his UFO experience, his first book on UFOs. And they were sitting at the table, and Jenny was sitting next to him. And Jenny was distracted by some of the ceremony going on up on the stage, and all at once, Alan, Dr. Hynek, shoves over a little piece of paper. And she opens it up and she reads it, and it says, the Air Force has a crash saucer. And, my God, how do you know that? So she brings out a little piece of paper from her purse, and she writes, who told you that? And Alan writes again, and he underlines it. AF, Air Force. He would not have even conceded that if it wasn't true. So that's how they were waving the carrot in front of him at times to keep him. So I know in the TV series, they show Dr. Hynek actually seeing preserved bodies, correct? And that he is actually present, or he has that opportunity. He never had such an opportunity. Because again, he couldn't even get Rumsfeld to admit that there was anything, behind the phenomenon itself. You gotta make sure I stay on. I'm 2 hours over, so I better. What a smug look. Politics withstanding. I mean, the fact that you look down at any American and just basically say, I don't care if you elected me, I don't care that I work for you, I don't owe you anything. And especially the truth. There's the scene from the Close Encounters movie. Next time you watch it. Yeah. And what was great was, that was the closest he came to the real thing. Being there, as I said, that he wanted to be part of the end chase. Be there at the finish line. After they filmed the Close Encounters movie, and we had a little celebration at the Hynek residence in Evanston. And so I took Alan aside, we were next to the dining room, and I said, Alan, so I suppose Close Encounters is your favorite UFO movie from now on. And he went, no. I still agree with you, Don. It's still the day the earth stood still. You've all seen this movie, correct? If you haven't, I mean, it's about the best science fiction, and it's my favorite UFO movie ever made. Robert Wise, who directed this movie, who did the first Star Trek movie, and he was the line editor for Citizen Kane, he did West Side Story, he did Sound of Music, so he was one of the best directors in all of Hollywood. And we knew Robert Wise through the development of our Roswell movie. And we have the pictures when he came to the premiere of our Roswell movie at the Directors Guild in Hollywood. And his shaking, and I am so proud of you boys. Just imagine, from someone who made this movie, and that many years later, and saying he was proud of us. So just, again, Hynek would have loved to have been there, because he also would have been proud. There's Condon again. I mentioned George Weinbrenner, and it's Bob Ebenegger. He was contracted by the Air Force to do a documentary on UFOs. And he would go to Weinbrenner's office at Foreign Technology, and Weinbrenner would deny he ever knew Hynek. Never worked with him. And so Weinbrenner finally handed Ebenegger a book he took down from a bookshelf. And it was UFO Experience. And inside, Emmenegger happened to go start paging through it. Weinbrenner tried to take it away from him quickly. But not until Emmenegger saw the inscription inside, "To my good friend George from J. Allen Hynek." So much for not knowing him. It's the late Len Stringfield who started the whole crash retrieval collection of stories, even regarding Roswell and Kingman and Aztec and Del Rio and so on, and collecting more and more of these stories. And who should latch on to him? I have a little sign. I have 5 minutes left. Okay. But who should latch on to him but Allen Hynek? So in the last couple of years of Hynek's life, what's it going to take for you to turn over the names of all your sources? Because what Stringfield did specifically was that he served as a magnet because he respected the confidentiality, the anonymity of all these witnesses. And so Hynek was pleading with him, what's it going to take for you to finally give us something to investigate? Because they're just stories without the names. We need to follow up. Because Hynek again realized his days were dwindling and he needed the proof, he needed the truth once and for all. So Hynek finally approached him. One last chance, one last opportunity, and said, if I could bring in one indisputable, irrefutable individual with the utmost credibility who would assist me and we would work together. We would report to you, Len, we would turn over all of our information, but we need access to your data, we need the names. And who was that person? How many don't recognize Neil Armstrong? How many here have ever heard that Neil Armstrong was interested in crash retrieval cases and that he was willing to work with Hynek on these reports? I could show you the letters between them. And then what happened was Armstrong was teaching at the University of Ohio in Cincinnati, and he got transferred. He went over as far as to Iowa, received a consulting job. So it kind of took him out of the picture, and so it languished for a number of months, and then it fell apart. Because Stringfield was only willing to do it if all parties involved were right there. There was going to be no phone discussions, no letters. They were going to, and Armstrong finally, well, I can't drive back and forth from Iowa to Ohio. But the key point is, he originally was willing to do it. And the one case he was specifically interested in was Roswell. I mentioned Philip J. Klass earlier, the self-appointed skeptic, arch skeptic. Hynek's second book would be with Dr. Jacques Vallée. One of the things that, a couple minutes yet, destroyed in many ways Hynek's confidence was that the debate, many of you remember or recognize the late Carl Sagan of Cornell University and his billions of billions, of occupied, inhabited planets throughout the world. Well, Hynek and Sagan would have a debate at one time. And Hynek came out and almost classic because he was very nervous in debating Sagan. And he would come out almost like in classic Don Knotts, Barney Fife type of, just reading his paper. And Sagan would come out and just take the microphone and he would do his whole presentation like this. Hynek never got over it. For the rest of his life, we'd be working in the field, and Alan would go, but what will Carl say? What will Carl say? He was always concerned what Carl would say about his case reports. And Sagan, as we remember, became also an arch skeptic, the bunker. He and the late Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, they all became the founders of the group Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, CSICOP. And we debated them on one occasion as well. Ted Phillips, mostly known for crash retrieval, as far as trace retrieval cases, CE2s, landings, interactions, like Delphos, Kansas, the very famous landing there. And Hynek became especially excited about such cases because, again, it could potentially provide physical evidence. And again, without the funding, it didn't get anywhere. There's Alan with his late wife, Mimi, and I'm going to... 2 points, and many of you have heard this before. But just as I want you to remember this as you continue, and I appreciate, I'm happy for the fact that Blue Book has been renewed, and they're already describing it as the new X-Files. They're actually labeling it as the new X-Files. So it's got legs. It's going to continue. But this is what Brigadier General Carroll H. Bullander, and he's often quoted for this in stating as far as what the function of Blue Book actually was. Quote, and he was the Chief of Staff of Research and Development in Washington. Quote, reports of unidentified flying objects which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, which is Joint Army Navy Air Force Procedure 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. So in other words, as Hynek always told us, the hardcore cases, the national security cases, the cases that really were relevant, were important, were never part of the Blue Book system. Blue Book just never saw them, never had access to them. Because as General Arthur Exon described to us, the true investigation, which was Squadron 4602, Air Intelligence Squadron out of Ent Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, and they were the ones who were often lecturing Hynek about his methodology. These were the officers that would come on the right path. They would change from civvies on a commercial flight into their uniforms, and they would fly off in one direction on a major, as far as a jet, 8 to 10 of them, while Blue Book and their 2 investigators in a single engine plane would fly off in the other direction. And the actual case reports would go to the Pentagon, whereas Blue Books were the mundane, the lights in the sky. Nothing to see here, ladies and gentlemen, nothing to see here. When Hynek was dying, and they removed the cancerous tumor from his brain at the Moffitt Clinic in San Francisco. And he was in recovery. And even then, as he was tossing and turning, and he kept saying over and over again, why can't they tell me now? Why can't they tell me even now? And they never did. So I'm wondering if that's what this TV series will eventually also demonstrate. That any one of us could devote that much of our lives to this country and essentially be just hung out to dry. No resolution, no payback, nothing. Unless because the subject is that important, that much of a concern, it's that momentous as I just described. It's that big that they still can't disclose, they still can't. How many here this afternoon believe that we're going to get disclosure at some point in our lifetimes? Good for you. Good for you. No, truly. Because I'm sorry. Now, quickly, how many explanations are they up to with Roswell? 4. 4 explanations for the same incident. I always joke that husbands should try that with their wives if they come home too late. But yet there again, we let the government do it. And there's one last point I need to make. Project Blue Book was declassified in 1977. For one thing, it mentions 20 gun camera cases it references. Where are those films? It was all declassified. They're referenced right in the documents. But wouldn't we love to see the gun camera film? The actual footage? So when anybody tells you, oh, it's all been disclosed, I have colleagues who are pro-UFO who say, oh, all the Blue Book files have been disclosed, nothing, there's nothing more to investigate. They're either fools or they too are lying. And the other point quickly is, Blue Book was strictly an Air Force investigation. Where are the Army? Where are the Navy? Where are the Marine Corps? National Guard? Coast Guard? They had their own separate investigations. Blue Book was Air Force. So there's a ton of other additional case reports out there. Now I'm mentioning all that because I encourage you to continue watching the series, but watch it with a high degree of suspicion and question, and just realize it's entertainment, it's much creative license. J.Allen Hynek would be proud of it because he is being portrayed as a hard-nosed scientist who is strictly looking for the truth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to believe that all of us here this afternoon, isn't that all that any one of us still wants? It's all we want, the truth. We can handle it. We can handle it. Back at Roswell in 47, they lived it, and they handled it. So with that, I commit, and I commemorate, and I give full tribute to Dr. J.Allen Hynek, and as his wife Mimi often would say to us, Alan would be so proud of you boys, and I can't, as far as take that as a better compliment. And to Dr. Hynek, I salute you. Thank you. So we can do, I guess we can do a little Q&A, if anybody...
Is this one on? Can you guys hear me okay?
And they'll bring the microphone to you.
All right, if you guys have a question, raise your hand. We'll come with you to the mic.
In his book, Project Beta, Greg Bishop asserted that Dr. Hynek brought a computer and a computer program to Paul Benowitz. Do you know anything about that?
I've heard, and Benowitz was with the Area Phenomenal Research Organization at the time, and he was the one that came out with all these reports of a secret facility at Dulce, outside of Albuquerque. And there was all types of efforts to discredit him, and I've talked to researchers, even bragged about how they tried to mess with him as far as mentally, that type of thing. We found nothing in the files that suggested that Hynek had any contact with Benowitz. Though Benowitz, in working with APRO, worked directly under Coral and Jim Lorenzen. And Hynek would have worked through them and may have then, as far as had contact in that regard. I do remember one time where Jim Lorenzen was pleading with Hynek to take over APRO at one point. So, and I know that has something to do with it as well in the situation with Benowitz. So, if I had anything directly, I would mention it, but no. So.
When I went to Roswell back in '94, '95, a friend of mine was born there. He told me, showed me the place, but there was an Air Force base there. But the UFO had landed. The Air Force base was there before or after the UFO crashed?
Okay, the Roswell Army Airfield, the brief field, the crash itself is 75 miles north of Roswell. The Roswell Army Airfield was south of the town. It was the first nuclear bomb wing. The 509 bomb group was the first atomic bomb wing in the world at that time. They were the best officers, pilots, crew, doctors, nurses, all stationed at Roswell. In fact, the two B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs in Enola Gay and Boxcar were hangared at Roswell. So the very fact that that particular squadron would also then be involved with the first UFO crash of that sort. I know there's conjecture as to whether it was the first one, but it was the first one where the military actually announced, they put out a press release that they captured a flying saucer.
But it wasn't there that landed?
It wasn't there, it was outside, it was 75 miles outside of the town, right. It wasn't on the base, no. But they were the ones who did the actual recovery operation, yes. No. There's a lot of stories, a lot of rumors, and that's what Dr. Hynek used to always talk about, that a good investigator has to separate the wheat from the chaff. So, one more quickly. I'll be out at the table, so. As I need
One
to
more.
request, one more, do we have?
Over here. Regarding Billy Meyer, has anybody done a credible investigation for or against the claims of Billy Meyer?
I would refer you to Dr. Bruce McAbee, naval optics engineer, and as far as the photographs and the film, and even in the jail at Hynek, when Hynek died, and we renamed the center, the jail at Hynek Center for UFO Studies. And McAbee has done, as far as the most detailed analytical research on the Meyer films and photographs, which we reported in the International UFO Reporter. And he thoroughly dispelled and explained away as far as everything that he was provided. And there we're talking in the late 1980s already. So, and I know there are many who still believe and accept. But again, we have to honor the scientific as far as research. And as far as I'm concerned, McAbee thoroughly explains away the Meyer story. So, okay, with that, I thank you once again. And I apologize for going over, so thank you.
We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we have Colonel Holt coming up next.